Hey guys, and welcome to the next and last video in our series of the instruction guide for the ROTJ. So we are going to install our hoses. As you can see, we have them laid out here. And then we are also going to do our final assembly, which includes putting the ROTJ together and then installing that onto our base. So we've got all of our pieces on the table now, and we're going to start with that final assembly. You can see we have the body laid out in front of us, and I have ordered our hoses from largest to smallest, and I have moved the hoses that go onto the body forward so you can see which ones are going to be attached to the body. The one thing that's different about this ROTJ versus the ESB is that there are no hoses that connect from the body to the head and no hoses that connect from the head to the body, which makes disassembly much easier. So that's a really nice bonus. So let's go ahead and get started installing our hoses. So I'm going to grab this first hose. This is going to be our large hose. And this is really cool. One of the main features of the ILM hose section is that they're actually springs. And they make just a really cool detail bit. So this hose is going to go on the back nipple here. We're just going to press this on. I'm not going to glue anything in place because, again, when we're talking about painting our ROTJ, there's going to be a lot of pieces that we want to be able to temporarily remove so that we can paint them separately, or they might block something that's going to do damage to our base coat. So as much as possible, I am not going to glue any of these pieces in place. If I have to glue something in place, I'm going to use the smallest, tiniest drop of glue possible so that I can then pull this off after assembly and then paint what I need to and then reinstall these. So this goes on the back nipple here, and then when I flip this over, this is going to cross over on top of this hole, and then it's going to be installed on the nipple that is to the farthest edge. So I'm just going to grab some tweezers here and install that back there just like that. Then we're going to grab our second longest hose. That is going in the frontmost nipple. And then this one is simply going to loop forward. There we go. We'll see if that stays. So now you've got two installed. The next one, and this one may or may not stay, is the next largest hose, which is the smallest one. And this one actually fits in here. So I am going to have to use a little bit of glue. And then this piece is going to go to this little nipple right here. Okay, so those are your first three hoses. Now, we've got our two last hoses. So the smaller one is going to be installed first. Again, just use a little bit of glue. That's going to go in the first side hole. Okay, the one that's closest to the center. And then whenever you're ready to paint, get your base coat of paint on, and then this one you can press off to the side and kind of almost over the top of this screw right here, and just kind of glue the angled part in place, because it just kind of leans over just like this, okay? So that's going to be its eventual permanent position. Now this one, the last one, slides over that nipple and then just gets inserted into that circular slot. Okay, so we've got all of our front pieces installed. We've got all of our back pieces installed. Again, for the final part, you're going to just glue this one down. You could also glue this one a little bit straighter if you wanted to, but you don't want to do that until you've got your first coat of paint on there and get that base color done. You can do this before weathering, but you might also want to get a base color on your springs. So that just makes the process easier. So this is the setup for springs. So super simple for the body. So let's go ahead and move on to the head. Okay, so let's grab our head and flip it upside down. So we've got 3 springs left. So we're going to start with our smallest spring here. So this one just fits into the back. Just like that. The second largest one is going to fit in this hole. And then we're just going to stretch it to this one. Okay, so we've got that one installed. So I ended up having to use a little bit more glue than I would have liked to be able to temporarily remove this one. So worst case scenario on this, it does stick up nicely, so you should be able to airbrush underneath this, but I'm still hopeful that I can just pop these off. But if you can't, you know, that is part of the process. For yourself, of course, you can do the base coating before any of this installation and just do this part of the video later. Okay, so we've got our hoses installed. So the next and final step here is these 2 silicone pieces, and they actually attach to the back of our guns and then also to the body. So this is going to be a little bit tricky because we want to be able to paint this separately. So we'll figure out how this goes together temporarily to be able to show you, and then get that set up. So starting with the front, we've got, again, these two pieces that need to be installed, and these hoses attached to the guns. So I'm going to put this to the side just for a second, and I'm just going to have to show you how these go together. I'm not actually going to glue them in place, because once I do, they are going to be permanently attached, and we do not want everything painted. So what you're going to need for this is some shrink wrap, and this is not included in the kit, but you could buy a package of shrink wrap from Amazon, and shrink wrap is really good to have on hand for any model maker. So just buy a package of shrink wrap. This is 1 mil, this is 3 mil. Out of the 1 mil, you're going to cut 2 centimeter pieces, and you're just going to glue those 2 centimeter pieces on the back, just like this, after painting these gray. So that is very important. After painting them gray, but before weathering, glue these in here. Then your silicone little tubing, or PTFE tubing, is just going to slide on in and attach. So you don't even have to glue this in. It's just going to be in there like a collar, okay? And that's how that attaches. And you'll have 2 pieces, basically, that attach in here, just like that. All right? So that's step number 1. So get your stuff painted, then you're going to install these. Next, moving to the inside, you have 3 millimeter heat shrink. You're going to cut that into 1 centimeter sections, and we're going to go ahead and use a little bit of glue and install those right on those half circle pieces. These will get painted gray, just like the rest of the body. And I'm sorry if you can't see this from the top camera. I'll flip it around in just a second. Okay, so you can see that in here. Just pressing that nice and flat. So again, these permanently installed, they're just going to get painted gray just like everything else. Now, your silicone, or your PTFE tubing, gets glued into these holes here, and then it's going to run through that channel, and then it's going to loop back around and go into the heat shrink on either side. So I hope that makes sense. So they're just going to go like this. You'll have your heat shrink glued on. You could just slide that in there. It's going to go through this collar, and it's going to attach into these little holes straight up and down. I'll show you on the other side. It slides through here. It's going to bend and go into a little channel. You can see it just like that. And then this will loop around and go into the back of the gun. Okay? And that's it. That's all your hoses. So just remember, do not install these because they're supposed to remain the same color that they're supposed to be, white. So don't install them until after you get your base color on. You may want to wait until for these parts, unless there's additional weathering that you can see on in the Chronicles book or something like that. There is some mist spraying for some weathering before you might do oils and hand painted weathering. If you feel like you're going to accidentally spray paint these guys, if they're supposed to remain clean, which we would double check during the painting portion, don't install them until the very end. Okay, so you can just set them to the side. So we're just going to put a tiny little drop of glue here and here, and get our gun installed so that this thing looks decent when it's posed. And the next portion of this video is going to be installing all of our parts. So we can go ahead and set this to the side. Okay, so let's go ahead and grab this. So these are the last little metal pieces that we have. So if I separate this is our neck. So that we can go ahead and slide these guys together. And then we've got 2 big screws left from our packages. So let's go ahead and install these guys. There we go. And then let's see what size we are working with here. Number 3. So this one's a little bit tricky as far as finding the right tightness. Because if you make it too tight, you don't want to put a tremendous amount of force on your head to be able to switch the angles. But if you make it too loose, then it can be floppy. So you want just the right amount of pressure to be able to move it around. Okay, so we can grab our body here, and we're just gonna stick that in there. Now, if you want to tighten that up, that's your little screw right in here. But we've got a pretty decent fit already, so that's pretty much that part done. The next step is going to be installing our legs. So your left hip, first off, your slots go forward, and then your left hip, remember, if you rotated it around, it still has the angled parts facing outward. So that's how you can tell the left hip. On the right hip, slot faces forward, the angles face outward for the top, and if you rotated it around, then they're reversed. So that's your right hip. And your sticky glue should still be sticky. So we're just gonna stick these in perfectly perpendicular for the moment. This just gives us plenty of room to work. Okay. And now we can go ahead and remove those bottom screws. Now, let's grab some legs. So our first leg is our left-hand side leg. So we're just going to insert that guy. Let that relax. And then let's insert this guy. Okay. Now to get him up and moving, we're going to have to tighten some things up. So we can already see the rotation of the hips needs to be tightened, which means it's a great idea that we went back through, or that we did that installation process of putting the adhesive glue down. So if we hadn't done that, then it would have been really, really difficult for us to adjust. Okay, so we've got a somewhat so-so initial pose. Everything works. I've gone ahead and tightened things up. Your hips, so those are the parts. If I rotate this around for you, so the parts that can rotate right here, so those are the parts that are going to cause you the most trouble when you're getting your initial pose together. Everything else seems to be very easy to just manage and tighten up really quick and get your pose set. So once you pop off your temporary glue spaces and tighten these up, be very careful not to strip out your little set screws. If you're still having a little bit of trouble getting this to stay tight, it's better off at this point to lay this thing on its back. Don't put the head on. Lay it on its back, keep these things off, remove the set screws enough to where you can slide the hip apart to separate it. Stick a little bit of super glue on there, then put them back together, twist them around a little bit so that you can create that friction like we talked about with all the other joints. That just allows for the screw not to have as much stress. And I think that's the main point about this armature system is The screws these days are not as strong as the screws back in the 70s and early 80s. So it's just a lot easier to strip these screws out instead of being able to tighten them down. So you don't want to put a lot of stress on the head of the screw. So it's better to create more friction so that the screw does a little bit less work. So now that we've got this initial part set up, the next process for this is we're going to reset our cameras. As you can see, we've got our little close-up camera really close. We're going to reset our cameras. We're not going to worry about putting our little accessories and stuff on there, even for temporary purposes quite yet, because the next part of this is going to be grabbing the base from the box, and we're going to get our holes drilled and get our armature stand mounted. And that's going to kind of wrap up this instruction guide. So let's get reset, and then we'll begin that process. Okay, so we've got our base into position, and I have placed the ROTJ onto the base. This is not the final pose, but I have basically centered the ROTJ just into position forward and back, kind of where I want it, on side to side and forward and back. You can still move the legs in any position that you want to, but basically the armature is kind of where I'm thinking that the body, the central body, is going to be. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to put together our actual armature itself. So you've got your pole, and you're going to feed this piece with the larger holes. So you've got smaller holes and larger holes. So put the larger holes facing upwards, and then the larger two holes facing outwards. Then you're going to feed your little bar through here. This piece fits inside like this, and you've got a basic armature mount, okay? You're going to take your bag eye, and those are all the screws that are going to be used to tighten that armature. And I believe those are all number 3s. Let's see if I've got a number 3 in screwdriver. Yes, I do. So we'll go ahead and drop these guys in here. I'm not going to tighten them all the way. You want to make sure that you've got full range of motion. Because we're going to be doing adjustments on the fly, measurements, etc. Okay. So we've got full range of motion here. Now, real quick, before we slide this around, one thing that I did on this that you can do if you want to, and this is just for a matter of safety for the base. So on Amazon, you can buy a wide variety of different felt or rubber pads. And I went ahead and put some felt pads on the bottom of the metal feet. So the beautiful satin finish that we have on this base can be easily scratched, and we want to make sure that we prevent that. And if you're going to be kind of dragging your feet around and posing or rotating this around, there is a high likelihood, and we've done this with the ESB sample, that the feet, just because of the metal nature and the edges, can mar the finish of your black base. So go ahead, and if you have any of that stuff on hand, or a simple temporary fix would be to take some tape and put some tape on the bottom of the feet. What I went ahead for the bottom of the armature is I put some green painter's tape on the bottom, and that allows this to slide around, and that can permanently stay. That does not have to go anywhere. Once this is screwed down, it'll just be fine. What I did to make sure that the green painter's tape is not going to show up is after finishing, I took a brand new number 11 blade and I put it at an angle and chamfered the edge of the tape to make sure that it was inside the edge of the metal surface so that you can't tell that there's tape there once it is screwed in place. So that's just a little tip to make sure that nothing actually rubs or scrapes against this black base, okay? So now that we've got this into position, we want to take some tape and we want to protect the surface where we're actually going to be doing some drilling, because we want to pre-drill our holes and we don't want any damage to occur to the surface of the base where we do our pre-drilling. So I'm just going to place 2 pieces of tape, generally off center, away from me, because that's generally where this armature is going to go. Because if you look at the armature, it is off center away from you. Actually, it's off center close to me, a little bit closer to me. Oh, this way, sorry. This way. Off center a little bit away from me, just like this. So your small bar is closest to you, the big bar is farther away from you, the heads of the screws are facing upwards. This is how it's supposed to look, just like this. Now let's talk about screws. Inside your bags, you're going to find 2 tiny black set screws. Those are for the armature base, so you can use those to set the pull in place. And then, like I mentioned in episode 1 or 2, I believe, they gave us what they call mounting wood screws, but they're just mechanical screws. So again, you could use these once you pre-drill to mount this in place if you're going to use glue. But then you're never taking this out again because the glue is going to hold this in place. So if you'd like to do that, feel free to do that. But this is not what I actually asked them to give. I asked them to give us wood screws, which I just pulled out of our bins. We had plenty of wood screws and just random screws around. So these are the screws that we're going to use, and you can grab these off of Amazon, anything. We're using a 3/32 bit, and the screws themselves, I'm going to give you a millimeter distance because that's just easier for us to measure. It's 1, 2, it's a 3 millimeter. So if you want to translate that into imperial, you can, but it's around 3 millimeters. And whatever length you want to. Doesn't take much to be able to hold this in. So that's what you're going to start with. Now, let's figure out where our mounting is going to take place. So we need to install the armature. So hold on to your ROTJ, and you're going to get your pull installed. And then you're going to get this guy in place. Then we're going to pick it up a little bit. And install it here. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to measure and figure out kind of where we want to put this. So we're going to be looking for a center position. And it looks like our center position is going to be at 4 inches in, and looks like 1 1/4 inches in from here. And that's at a slight angle. So let's look at it from here. That brings us to 1 inch. But that covers, so if we did that, then that's going to cover our white strip. So what we can do is we can scoot this in so that it's inside the white strip. And that brings us back to around 1 1/4. So let's get it to where it's just inside the white strip. And we want to make sure that it is basically level. It will level itself once you tighten everything down. And then this is obviously adjustable. You can move the body side to side. This can all go up and down. We just want to get it generally in place. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark with a pen where my holes are. And then we're just going to remove what we just installed very carefully. Just like that. So we can just set that to the side. Now we're going to take Mr. ROTJ and we're going to set him to the side. I think I'm actually going to give this off camera to Justin to hold while I do the drilling. And then we're going to grab our 3/32 bit. And we know the distance down that we need to go by just marking that with tape. And we'll go ahead and do our drilling. Okay. So now it's time to remove the tape. And we're going to take our armature stand, put that back on. I'm going to grab a hand screwdriver. You can do this with any screwdriver you want. And there we go. So now we're going to get this guy in place here. We're going to grab our little set screws. Let's figure out what size this is, and if we have something already prepared for it, we do. Okay. So now that we're mounted up, I would clean this off of fingerprints. I would put gloves on for this purpose. I'm just going to show you how it gets installed, and then we'll do a final cleaning posing, and I'll show you what the final picture looks like after we do that. So that's basically it. Now at this point, it's standing on its own. Nothing's been tightened, and it's just kind of sitting there. So you can go ahead and go in, do all of your posing, and then you're just going to go in one by one, and you're just going to tighten your screws to make sure that nothing can move. You can tighten your back screw, make sure that the angle's right, tighten your armature screw, make sure all that is completely stable, and then tighten all of your leg screws, tighten your feet screws, all of that kind of stuff. Make sure everything's going to be nice and stable, and then you're done. You're ready to display. Just make sure, when you're working with your base, fingerprints show up. So if you've got some rubber gloves, you can use some rubber gloves for all of this work. Wipe this thing off with some basic cleaner. Degreaser is basically all you need to be able to get this all nice and clean. Just a very light degreaser. But that's basically it. So we're going to go ahead and just do a mock-up pose, and we'll show you the final product. Okay, so I've gone through and I've set up a basic pose just using a screen grab from Google, and you guys can just do that by looking up ROTJ and/or something like that, and that'll give you plenty of different options to look at for setting up different poses. One of the main cool things that you can do with this type of armature that you can't do with even the ESB is this nice wedge pigeon-toed leg setup where we're tilting the legs inward and then we're also angling them outward. And that is we're able to do that because of the extra joints inside the legs as well as the extra joints inside the hips. And that's just something that's really cool. Now, one last part that we didn't show being installed, but is super, super easy. You don't want to do this until you've got the base coats on, but you've got those two shields right here. You'll see two rectangular holes. They just get glued in to those front two rectangular holes. You can't miss those holes. So just remember to put those on at the very end. They'll get the same base color, and then you can glue those on. But that's it. So now you're ready to go. Whenever you want to, you can repose it as many times as you want, and you can put it in as many poses as you want. You can even have both legs floating and have the whole thing held up by the armature. Wouldn't recommend that, but you can have at least one leg floating if you want to. But it's a beautiful model, and now we're ready for paint. And I think we are going to show a nice painting video, at least go over all the basics of painting one of these guys. So look forward to that next series coming up pretty soon. We'll probably start working on that next week. So thank you very much, guys. We'll see you in the next one. Bye.